Welcome to another edition of Starcatcher, the podcast. True stories from Hollywood's golden age, based on the top-selling book by the same name, Starcatcher. What do Jonathan Winters, Anthony Hopkins, and Carol Burnett have in common? All three of these Hollywood legends crossed paths with award-winning Hollywood writer and producer John Frederick, and are featured in his amazing new book, Starcatcher, a true-life Hollywood fantasy. Now, John will share some stories about all three Hollywood legends, and in the case of Jonathan Winters, a cast of many, including Maude Frickert.
Maude Frickert was kind of it still is kind of a salute to, she's not quite a dirty old lady, but very close.
Oh, wild. My support hose just tingled. Boy.
Make a wish and blow out the candles.
All right, Agatha. I'll wish for a 22-year-old boy to chase me through the cemetery. I hope he catches me.
John, you spent time with Jonathan Winters. What was he like?
Well, Jonathan, certainly kind of like Robin Williams, an absolutely unique talent.
Here's a quick clip of Jonathan Winters and Robin Williams' total improv.
Reverend Ainsley, my hands are arthritic, as you can tell.
Well, just consider them not his hands anymore, but his paws. Be ready to do this. Get a little cat tree. Don't be afraid. Say yes, yes. Don't be afraid. I'm going to put my hands on your head now.
No, but they're in my hands. Why would you put your hand on my head?
Because
there's nothing the matter with my head.
It's a two-shot. Go with me. It's a two-shot. Work with me now. Work with me, demon spirit. Bobby, get the extra.
Look
ready.
at my hands. They're straight out. They're straight out.
Now you can serve things. Now you can serve things. Go table for two. Table for two.
The thing that was amazing to me about him was the spontaneity. He could do 5 minutes if you bumped into him on the street. And I did that several times. And several times I tried to bump into him on the street because I would see him. There was a writers' conference in Santa Barbara, and he attended that faithfully. He has a home, or had a home, I should say, in Santa Barbara, and another one, I think, in Toluca Lake down here, fairly close to Hope. His talent was so unique, they kept trying to fit him into places where it really didn't go. In other words, he had to follow a script. Improvisation was his thing. He wouldn't stay in the box. That's all there was to it. And so when I would see him, actually, I saw him probably a dozen times. Nothing serious, nothing. Of course, he was not. He was on. I think I discussed that Hope could be very serious about things, about life, and about news of the day, and so forth like that. Jonathan Winters, he would give you a routine and work in his characters. Maude Frickert, he'd come up with the darndest things you ever heard, and he also did that on his telephone. He changed the thing regularly. When you'd call his house, you'd get one of the characters, and he'd have a little riff, and you were laughing by the time. It was hard to be serious, and if you had a serious thing to talk to him about, it was hard to stay serious because you were still laughing from his introduction. So anyway, the best movie I think he did was called The Loved One. He played two parts. He played the Reverend Glenworthy, who had I think it was kind of a cemetery, mausoleum, forest lawn kind of complex that he wanted to turn into a 55 and over park. And so, and then he had a crazy brother who was kind of a ne'er-do-well. It was a perfect thing for him. There was some improvisation that he could do, and he did plenty. It's quite a good movie, and certainly the first part. The part Jonathan was in was the part I liked best.
Was he in the service?
Jonathan was a Marine. He served in combat areas. I don't think he did combat. He was attached to an aircraft carrier, and they each have a Marine detachment. And that Marine detachment is not sent into combat because it's for kind of policing the ship itself. They would have run the brig, and they would stand sentry duty in front of let's say the captains, or if there was a flag officer on board, there'd be sentries outside their quarters, their office, and so forth. He was in the Marines, but I do not think he was He wasn't on Iwo Jima or Tarawa or anything like that. So, but he really had a very soft spot in his heart for the Marines. And, once a Marine, always Marine. You're never a former Marine. And he took that very seriously. He was always good. He did USO tours too. He kind of appeared, I first saw him, I was still in high school probably, not much older than that. And he began to appear on The Tonight Show, which by then was hosted by Jack Paar. And he did a lot of appearances on The Tonight Show with Jack Paar. And that was, something, black and white TV. And whenever Jonathan was on, he wanted to watch. And he got into some problems. I think he had depression. Again, it would be something, so many bad things happened to Robin Williams, and Jonathan mostly escaped those things, but I know he had depression, and Williams did too, and he was treated. He was not arrested, but he was taken off a mast of a ship in San Francisco Harbor. They kind of threw a net over him, more or less. He was trying to talk to Martians from the mast, and I think as I recall, he ended up spending some time in an alcohol rehab situation. Silver Hill, which is kind of a upscale thing back east. I think it's in Connecticut. Anyway, Jonathan wrote a book or two. He was a very good painter, and again, Red Skelton. Both of them were very talented artists. The thing about Skelton, his work sold for a lot of money, and so did Jonathan's. But Skelton only painted clowns, nothing else, just clowns. Jonathan actually had some range as an artist. He painted all kinds of things, landscapes and what have you. But he was a unique figure, let's face it, a very, very, very funny man.
Perhaps Jonathan Winter's most popular movie was the comedy It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. That was produced and directed by Stanley Kramer.
Stanley Kramer was not noted for comedy, let's put it that way. He did some very serious subjects. That was usually he did Judgment at Nuremberg and things like that. The idea of having an all-star comedy movie, It's a Mad, Mad World, must have been quite something to put together. But, they had, a great cast, and Jonathan was, I think he was probably the best thing in it. But they had everybody. I mean, who wasn't in it? Everybody that had ever been, a comic in the movies got to be in It's a Mad, Mad World. It was successful. Whether it was a wonderful movie or not may be open to question, but it certainly it made money, and it satisfied a lot of people. And, of course, Buddy Hackett was in it, too, and he was a chip off Jonathan's block, kind of hard to write for. It turned out to be probably one of the most successful things. And Stanley Kramer had a soft spot in his heart for Spencer Tracy, for example. And so he put Spencer Tracy in that movie. I think Stanley did, if I'm not mistaken, he also did Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. You couldn't get insurance on Tracy because of his health. And so Stanley rolled the dice, and he put in both movies, and he played a kind of a straight part in It's a Mad, Mad World as the sheriff. Everybody else did comedy, but of course Spencer Tracy played it straight. He had, I think, William Demarest was there with him. It's enjoyable. I like to see it again and again. I've seen it several times. There aren't too many other things I can think of that Jonathan was in that I can remember. Television was a better, if you could freewheel. Television, you got times, you got to fill in a certain time and so forth. He would be better on, like radio for Stan Freberg or something like that. That would be more his style. The Wild World of Jonathan Winters, I think they tried that on television. They tried several things, and it was always worth watching, but he couldn't be put in a box. Television had a habit of putting you in a box.
There was a very popular writers' conference in Santa Barbara. In fact, I believe it's still going on, called the Santa Barbara Writers' Conference. It was started by author Barnaby Conrad. Jonathan Winters was a mainstay at that conference.
In Santa Barbara, every year at the Miramar Hotel, which was a wonderful old landmark, the railroad track goes right through the grounds, and they had bungalows and things, and some great little bungalows on the water on the beach there. Very valuable property. Every year he had a writers' conference where people would come and they would get to hear some of the most famous authors, everybody from Buckley to Sue Grafton, Ross MacDonald, all of the crime fiction writers went there, Elmore Leonard. And of course, Jonathan appeared there because he had written books too. He was there every year faithfully. My wife and I bumped into him at lunch, and he did the 3 minutes to her. That was Gail was quite a great beauty, and he obviously appreciated beauty because he did a little routine for her and acknowledged me even. And so anyhow, the writers' conference, I don't know how many years it lasted, but it was a big deal. Anyone who was interested in writing or who had some desires that way, you could go and be taught by people like, Stanley Kramer, for example, would be a person that you'd see. And Charles Schultz came up and had a whole hour, and Barnaby, and they had some just first-class people, the celebrities from the local area like Bob Mitchum and Jane Russell and Dick Widmark and people like that would show up. So you could, if you wanted to see movie stars, that was the place to do it. They were avid listeners. They'd talk about the different aspects of writing, and agents would come and talk about what they did, famous agents. And as I say, every author you could think of would show up there. There was one other group, by the way, that Jonathan made an appearance at, and some of these other people. It was called the Round Table West. Adela Rogers St. John, who had been a publicist for MGM and who was very famous. Her father was a very famous lawyer, quite a swashbuckler. They would have meetings at the various hotels. They would go to La Quinta in the desert. They would go to Newport Country Club and the Balboa Bay Club. The Round Table also met at the Beverly Wilshire, which is one of the two great hotels in the Beverly Hills area. Anyway, Round Table West would have all the best authors come in. I went to one with Carol Channing. It was in Newport Beach. Carol Channing and Scott Marshall, and the lady that ran it was nice enough to seat my wife and I at Carol Channing's table, and Scott Carpenter, the astronaut, was also there. So that was amazing. And in the audience that day was Marge Champion. There were Martha Tilton, a lot of big band singers who had retired. Helen O'Connell, you'd see her there. It was something to see. And then they would have three authors talk about their books, and afterward they would sign them every time someone had a book came out. I think Neil Armstrong was there. Buzz Aldrin had been there. On and on and on. It was something. We went to that every month if we could, and Jonathan was quite a presence there, too. He would show up, and if he had a book, he'd come and talk about the book.
Jonathan Winters passed away of natural causes on April 11th, 2013, at his home in Montecito, California, at the age of 87.
We're going to break away for just a moment, then we'll be right back.
From the comedy genius of Jonathan Winters to one of Hollywood's great versatile dramatic actors, who at the age of 83 just won an Academy Award for the film Father, in which he portrayed a man who was battling dementia. John, you spent a fair amount of time with Anthony Hopkins.
Well, let's see. Anthony Hopkins is certainly a favorite of mine. I'm not alone. I would see him periodically at meetings where some of us go to kind of get our heads straight. He was and is not particularly a social creature. He's someone that would enjoy, for example, getting in his car by himself, let's say, and driving up the coast all the way to the Canadian border and just hanging out, kind of getting the feel and getting away from people. Every time I saw him, he was more than courteous. He's very, very, it's amazing, really. The best time I had with him was with a very close friend named Bob Palmer, who was a publicist. He was more than a publicist, though. He actually guided Tony's career. And, for example, he had to talk him into doing Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. It wasn't something he jumped at. Bob talked him into it. And, of course, it's probably an Academy Award-winning performance that had the least amount of screen time. I've heard it was as little as 12 minutes. If you think about it, it's the story of the girl, the FBI agent, and what's going on with her. And Hannibal just appears here and there, and it's always kind of a looming presence. But the amazing thing about Hopkins is he has a great gift. I mean, he's played Hitchcock, he's played Nixon. By the way, he doesn't care to do Americans. He says that his accent, his American accent, he can do other accents. He can be a German. He can be Hitler. He can be Alfred Hitchcock. But he has a tough time with an American accent, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, I met him, and Bob Palmer set this up, at Musso Frank's. And he was a star, but he was not a major star yet. And this would have been about 1985, 86, right in there. And so we met at Musso Frank's. Hopkins is a big fan of the history of Hollywood. I mean, he could have been probably a Laurence Olivier and stayed on the stage, but Hopkins, when he was a boy, and when he and I would talk that day, we talked about how we loved old movies and old radio, and this is what sparked his imagination. And he respected the stage, he honored the stage, but he was a movie star. You know, he was a stage star when he wanted to be, but he was a movie star primarily. So we were in Musso Frank's, which had been a haven. It's now celebrated its 100th year, which makes it prehistoric in Hollywood terms. Musso Frank's had been a writer's hangout in the 20s and 30s and so forth, and the writers loved it because they could run tabs there. Hemingway was there. Faulkner lived in a hotel less than 2 or 3 blocks from Musso's, which is on Hollywood Boulevard. And we were in the back room by the bar. Now, we weren't going to the bar, mind you. We were there to eat. The actor Paul Douglas once said he loved it there because it was like a New York bar. I mentioned that to Tony, and he was interested in Paul Douglas. He was interested in anybody who was in the movies when he first started watching them. He was a terrible student, and I was in the bottom third of my high school class. He was the same way. He just, it was not of interest to him. He didn't particularly care for school. Well, I don't know how it started, but I was talking about what he was doing, which was he was on television, doing television movies, and he was in movies. I think he'd just done Magic, I believe, some other things that he didn't particularly care for. And then he would do television movies where he played Hitler, he played the Lindbergh kidnapper, Hauptmann. He loved character roles like that. He just fitted so well into character parts. But it was unique in those days for a movie star to do television. Really, I think probably Joseph Cotton did a Bufferin commercial, and that was the first thing. You could never do that. And all of a sudden, you'd see Laurence Olivier selling Polaroid cameras, but Tony would go back and forth. And matter of fact, as we talked that day, he was going to London to open a new play called Pravda. He had not reached megastar status yet. That came actually, I think, with Silence of the Lambs. He was a very respected actor, and he was in many, many great films, but they were kind of art house films, some of them. Anyway, so we're talking. Once you got him opened up, he was a fascinating conversationalist. He was quite amazing, and so I was there to listen. So At some point, I wanted to talk to him about why he went back and forth between television and the movies. And so I said, now, what is it about English actors? And he reached across the table and grabbed my arm and squeezed tightly and said very clearly and rather loudly, Welsh. I'm not an English, he did not want to be called an English actor. And the Welsh, like the Irish, good old Celtic blood, are very, very sensitive. And as a matter of fact, as we speak, I think he's in Wales now. I think he's painting or something, He wasn't at the Academy Awards this year because he was in Wales painting and kind of touching base back home.
Anthony Hopkins won the 2021 Best Actor Academy Award for that brilliant portrayal of an elderly man suffering from dementia in the film Father, despite the fact that the late Chadwick Boseman was the overwhelming favorite to win the Best Actor award for his role in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Surprisingly, the award went to Anthony Hopkins, and also surprising was the fact that Anthony Hopkins was not there to receive the award.
He was not present. He was in Wales, as I said, painting. He was kind of shocked because he expected it to go to someone else.
And the Academy Award for actor goes to Anthony Hopkins, The Father.
Well, here I am in my homeland in Wales, and at 83 years of age, I did not expect to get this award. I really didn't. And very grateful to the Academy, and thank you. And I want to pay tribute to Chadwick Boseman, who's taken from us far too early. And again, thank you all very much. I really did not expect this. So I feel very privileged and honored. Thank you.
Glenn Ford said something about Ernie Borgnine, who was a character actor who became a star. And Glenn Ford said that Ernie Borgnine can be Ernie Borgnine all his life. Well, Tony Hopkins can be Tony Hopkins forever. And there'll always be parts for him. Anyway, we had a very nice lunch, very pleasant. We then got out. We wanted to go across the street. Bob Palmer had to do something with Dick Van Dyke, and so he went off, wanted to go, and I did too, to Larry Edmunds' bookstore, which is across the street. Musso's is at Cherokee and Hollywood Boulevard, and Larry Edmunds, a very, very famous bookstore that goes way back. And again, a lot of writers would hang out there. It's Hollywood history. You could get posters, lobby cards, all these things. It's probably been around for 50, 60 years, maybe more. And so we were walking across the street, and this is Hollywood Boulevard, and they're close to Hollywood and Vine, and there are a lot of tourists around. And so we're walking down the street, and I noticed that no one came up to him. No one recognized him. And I said something. I said, Tony, they don't know who you are. And he said, I don't want them to. So I got it, that it's famous. Movie stars are famous, for putting on dark glasses, and Elizabeth Taylor used to put on fright wigs and things like that. They called attention to the celebrity more than they disguised the celebrity. However he did it, he could be Mr. Everyman. You just didn't notice. He's only 5'9". He's not a big man. And it was just easy for him to fool all these people. And I regarded that as one. And we went across the street. We went into that bookstore, which is peopled by fanatic fans of the movies. That's all they get in there. It was as crowded as the sidewalk. Same thing. Nobody even knew who he was. He just was someone that was there. I thought it was one of the great performances of Anthony Hopkins' life, The Invisible Star. And of course, I did write about that in my book, Starcatcher, a true life Hollywood fantasy. To walk down Hollywood Boulevard with Anthony Hopkins was to live out a fantasy of mine. Who doesn't want to be seen with Anthony Hopkins? And the funny thing was, I was seen with Anthony Hopkins, and no one knew it.
Back in 1987, Anthony Hopkins was awarded the high honor of being knighted by Queen Elizabeth.
Yes, it is an honor. And of course, I noticed that, for example, there's a golfer who was knighted. Paul McCartney has been knighted. A lot of actors were knighted. Olivier was Sir Lawrence, and then he became Lord Lawrence. John Mills and others, Ralph Richardson, those just in front of Anthony Hopkins, were all Sir Ralph and Sir this and Sir John Mills and so forth. And actually, John Mills had been offered a lordship and turned it down. He said, Sir is enough. But the funny thing about Anthony Hopkins is he doesn't want to be called Sir. You don't address him like you'd address royalty. Anthony Hopkins, for whatever reason, prefers not to be accorded that honor, which he's entitled to, certainly in England, and would rather be called Tony. And so his friends call him Tony. I did too, of course. It's maybe it's a reality check for him. I mean, he's pretty humble. He can be, he's a pretty humble person. Maybe it's, reminding himself that he's really only Anthony Hopkins from a little town in Wales. Fortunate we have him here. And it actually broke up his second marriage because his wife preferred living in England, and Hopkins preferred living near Los Angeles. He has a place in Malibu now. But he lived in Los Angeles and has been here almost since he came to the country. It was something that actually even broke them up. Although they were, as they say, they remained close friends. But she was English and wished to live there, and he had become Americanized and wanted to live here. That's the way of the world.
For 11 seasons from 1967 through 1978, CBS Television was the home to one of America's most beloved ladies.
From Television City in Hollywood, it's the Carol Burnett Show, brought to you by your local quality Buick dealer. Wouldn't you really rather have a Buick?
John, you worked on an interesting project with Carol Burnett, and I believe you met her right after you came to Hollywood when you were in the Navy.
One of the great things about coming to Hollywood and working as a Navy public information officer, I got access to free tickets. This was at a time when the Carol Burnett Show was in the top 10, and it was in the top 10 probably for a long, long period. I got to go down to CBS probably a half a dozen times or more. I had, almost front row seats to the show. And she would come out. She'd bring out Harvey Korman and Tim Conway and introduce them and introduce anyone who was perhaps a star. And, of course, lots of stars turned up on the Carol Burnett Show. But the interesting thing about it was she had a question and answer thing she'd do with the audience. She wanted to take questions. She would introduce the cast and tell them what the show was going to be about. And so she'd ask questions, and everybody loved Carol Burnett. I mean, it's hard not to. She was very good, very gracious when she'd do the question and answer thing. And they had an interesting system on the Carol Burnett Show, which required a lot of intricate staging because there were dances and musical numbers and changes of costume and this, that, and the other thing. So what they did is they taped the rehearsal and then they taped the regular show. And what would happen is probably a lot of times you'd get pieces from the rehearsal that went into the main show because they were better and funnier. And so it was kind of a business of protection. It was a pleasure, for heaven's sake, a pleasure to go to CBS and watch that show. She was great.
Carol Burnett tells the story of how she got her start and why she pays it forward.
I was at UCLA in a musical comedy class, and our professor was going to grade us on scenes for our final at a very posh black tie party, and it went over very well. Then I went to the hors d'oeuvre table, and I'm stealing hors d'oeuvres. I'm putting them in my purse, and there's a tap on my shoulder. And I thought, oh my God, I'm busted. And it was this gentleman. He said, so what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, someday I hope to, have enough where I can go to New York, because I would love to be in musical comedy on Broadway. He said, well, I'll lend you the money to go to New York. And he said, there are stipulations. Never reveal my name. And if you are successful, you must promise to help others out that you believe in.
She also gave us a hand. We did a telethon for the National Council on Alcoholism. One of the people who appeared in it was Betty Ford, and I did an interview with her for that. We wanted to do it in LA, and we wanted to do it someplace convenient, so we went to Carol's house, and she opened her home and allowed us to film Betty Ford there. That week, I think, I played golf with Joe Hamilton, who was, of course, her husband. So, it went quite well. A little later on, we were doing a film on women and alcohol, and we had no host or hostess. And obviously, I had tried to find out from various doctors who work in the field, well, what about women and alcohol? What about that? And they would all say, as the men would say, beats me, So what I did eventually was to hire an all-female crew, grips, gaffers, director, a cinematographer, everybody, the lady who. And so there were no men around, no men in the credits. Actually, Jan Clayton, who had played Lassie's mother and was a friend, it's kind of a shame for me to say this because I had promised Jan that when we did a picture that involved women and alcohol, that I would have her host it. But there was another close friend of mine, a golf partner of mine named Dr. Jokichi Takamine. And Joe Takamine was a kind of a Beverly Hills character, although, he said he didn't want to be a millionaire. He just wanted to live like one. So he lived modestly, but he squired some of the prettiest girls in town and married a congresswoman and was the doctor to the stars. He was Nat King Cole's doctor. He ran the alcohol unit at St. John's Hospital, a very famous hospital in Santa Monica. So Joe called me, knowing that we were doing this movie, and said, I can get Carol Burnett. What do you think? And am I going to renege on my promise to Jan Clayton? Well, I did what any Hollywood producer would do. I went for the big star, and I felt a little guilty ever since. She did a wonderful job. She was actually struggling. Her daughter had a drug problem at the time, and Dr. Takamine and a lot of people were working with her. That's a sad story, the daughter. Carol was having problems with addiction in her family. Of course, she came from actually an alcoholic family, survived that. Then her daughter, who was probably a teenager and so was heavily into drugs and had a real problem. So Joe Takamine was their doctor, and they worked with her, and there were other famous people, and she went on television. She had some problems, and that was all a great drama playing out, and must have cost Carol Burnett a lot of sleepless nights or anxious moments. Eventually, Carrie got clean and sober and was doing very well as a performer herself. She had some real talent, and the talent as a writer, talent as she could have done anything. Unfortunately, she got cancer and died at a very young age, in her 30s. And Carol wrote a book about it, and that was just a sad thing. But as far as Carol working with us, I tried to stay away from that set. I have a picture of me kind of leaning in a doorway, and Carol's right next to me. They are discussing it. All the women are discussing the next shot and so forth. It was quite successful. You couldn't find a nicer person. I don't know anyone who dislikes her. She's still around, and I hope to see her again. I won't say I'll work with her again because I'm more or less out of the movie business and into the writing business. But to see the show and then to see her and to have her in a film that didn't have my name on it but it had my company's name on it, that was worth a lot.
Carol Burnett was in a number of movies, including Pete and Tilly, Alan Alda's Four Seasons, and a movie called The Life of the Party about the story of an alcoholic woman named Beatrice.
Carol's talent was more suited to television. She wasn't exactly a leading woman, but I mean, she played Mrs. Hannigan in Annie. She was in a lot of she did a film with Walter Matthau. There were several other films that she made, but they weren't really for her. They great fame came from the television show. She did quite a few movies. Her feature films were fun and good, but not necessarily memorable. You don't think of Carol Burnett as a movie star somehow. She was a television star. She was in movies, and she did movies with people like Walter Matthau and Alan Alda and and others. And she was in Annie, which was a big thing, played Mrs. Hannigan. But movies were just they weren't for her. She was really cut out for that television show. The Carol Burnett show was just, it was on as long as I could remember. They had reunions after that, and then they had, the whole cast would come back, and they had a show about the show. So that was her great media, and she's written several books too.
You can read more about Carol Burnett as well as countless other Hollywood legends that are brought to life in the new book Starcatcher, a true-life Hollywood fantasy. It's available at Amazon and wherever popular books are sold.
I'm so glad we had this time together, just to have a laugh or sing a song. Seems we just get started, and before you know it, comes the time we have to say so long.
That wraps up this edition of Starcatcher the podcast. True stories from Hollywood's golden age. As told by the man who was there when they said it, John Charles Frederick, a distinguished Hollywood producer who has some 50 films and documentaries to his credit, and is the author of the best-selling book by the same name, Starcatcher, a true-life Hollywood fantasy, which is available at Amazon and wherever popular books are sold. We certainly hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and if you did, there's something that you can do for us. Number one, you can subscribe to our podcast or follow our podcast. Number two, leave a review. Let us know what you think. It's important to us. And by all means, number three, share this with your friends. Now, in the next edition of Starcatcher the podcast, author John Frederick will reminisce about his encounters with Ernie Borgnine, Dick Van Dyke, Barbara Eden, and Shirley Jones. And we'll also find out why John Frederick wrote the book Starcatcher, a true-life Hollywood fantasy. Until next time, I'm Neil Scott. Hooray for Hollywood.
'Cause it makes me feel that